This story has one of the most insane plot twists we've ever covered on this channel. A bright, beautiful, outgoing 18-year-old named Whitney Sarek saw a sign that was asking for students to volunteer to the next day head out to this banquet hall to set up this big banquet for the school's new incoming president. Little did she know, she was within 24 hours of her life changing in the most drastic way imaginable. The following morning, they were kind of ushered into the van, and then the van pulled out of the parking lot and began heading north towards Fort Wayne. Whitney struck up a conversation with a 22-year-old senior named Laura Van Ryn. Whitney and Laura were total strangers, but they looked so similar physically. Whitney would turn and look next to her, and right as she did, Whitney realized something very strange. There was this bright light on the side of Laura's face. And then seconds later, that bright light had grown and the entire interior of the van was completely whited out. And then a second later, someone towards the front of the van yelled, "Oh my God, no!" And then the van went completely silent. Within minutes, dozens of 911 calls were coming in from motorists saying that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived on scene, they were braced for the worst. But even still, they were shocked at what they saw. Scattered all over the northbound and southbound lanes were all these huge chunks of jagged metal, there was glass everywhere, and there were bodies everywhere. That light that suddenly filled the entirety of the van were the headlights of an 80,000-pound, fully loaded tractor-trailer truck driven by Robert Spencer. Robert was a truck driver when he fell asleep at the wheel, at which point his truck veered off the road and crashed into Laura and Whitney's van, and when it did, the impact literally peeled off the side of their van and sent the van spinning. The students inside were literally being violently thrown out of the van into traffic. They would find Robert still in his truck, he was alive, but they would discover that of the 9 occupants inside of that van, 5 were deceased. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of April 27th, Whitney Sarek's family woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. It was the Grant County coroner telling them their daughter had been in a terrible accident and she was deceased. At the same time, 3 hours south, the Van Ryn family also was woken up in the middle of the night to a phone call, except the call they got was that their daughter Laura had been in that same crash, but she had survived, although she was in critical condition. In the days that followed, the Sarek family had Whitney's body transported to Gaylord, and then they began to plan for her funeral. A funeral that would have to be closed casket because of the extensive damage to Whitney's body. Meanwhile, Laura Van Ryn's family rushed to Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, and they would find their daughter bandaged head to toe with a neck brace on, laying in a hospital bed in a coma. Doctors would tell Laura's family there was no way of knowing if she would ever come out of that coma. And even if she did, she had suffered a serious brain injury, which likely would impact her ability to function. And so knowing that at best this was going to be a very long road to recovery, Laura's family decided to move her back home to Michigan to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids. 3 days after the accident, the Sareks would hold a visitation in their hometown of Gaylord. The following day, on April 30th, Whitney was buried. At the same time, Laura's family were given some incredible news. Based on brain scans, it looked very much like Laura would wake up from her coma. And then on Tuesday, May 16th, so 20 days after the accident, Laura woke up from her coma. And amazingly, at first, it seemed like her brain was functioning the way it should be. The family could not believe their luck. This was a miracle. Over the next few days, Laura would slowly regain her strength to the point where she could move some limbs and she could sit up in her bed. And then as for her cognitive function, it seemed like she was making strides, but then she would do something that would make doctors and her family and everybody around her start to question if her brain really was okay. Her physical therapist handed Laura a pencil, and then she put a pad of paper in front of her. And then the therapist told Laura to write a word down that was very specific. It was a word that Laura should know well, and a word that Laura should be able to spell. Laura took the pencil and very awkwardly and painstakingly wrote out a word. But when she was done, and the therapist looked at what she had written, It was wrong. It didn't make any sense. It was at this point that the therapist and the onlooking family started to realize that, her injury to her brain might be more extensive than we thought. However, as everyone in that room would soon find out, that was not the case. There was something much, much bigger going on. Back on April 26th, just minutes after the car accident, first responders began moving about the crash site to figure out who was deceased and who was still alive. When they found Laura, she was barely clinging to life on the side of the road, and so they rushed over to her, they put her on a stretcher along with her purse, which contained her driver's license. They put that all together, they put her on an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital. Once Laura arrived at the hospital, doctors would use her driver's license inside of her purse to identify her, and then they began wrapping her head to toe in bandages and casts. And when bandages began coming off over the following weeks, it was immediately obvious to everyone that this accident had significantly altered Laura's physical appearance, most notably her teeth. They almost looked like they had been shifted to one side in her mouth. However, to Laura's family, they didn't care how she looked. They only cared that she was still alive. But when Laura was handed that piece of paper and a pencil, and she was told to write her name, she did not write Laura. She wrote W-H-I-T-N-E-Y, Whitney. It would turn out a colossal mistake was made, and nobody caught it until that moment. The woman sitting in the hospital bed with the pencil and paper was not 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. The woman sitting in the hospital bed was 18-year-old Whitney Sarek. When Whitney was found on the side of the road clinging to life, the first responders thought the purse next to her was hers, and so they opened it up, they found a driver's license, they looked at it, and they looked at the victim on the ground, and they looked identical, and so they said, okay, this is Laura. And amazingly, Whitney's purse that contained her driver's license happened to land on the ground next to Laura's body, and so Laura was misidentified as Whitney Sarek. And so once again, the Sarek family received a call in the middle of the night from the Grant County coroner. Except this time, they were telling them that your daughter did not die in that car accident. She's alive. She's in Grand Rapids waiting for you. And so the Sarek family, they were completely shocked. They wanted this to be true, but it just seemed too good to be true. They had had a funeral for Whitney. They had buried Whitney. Except because it was closed casket, they never saw Whitney. And so the Sareks hopped on a plane, they flew to Grand Rapids, and they walked into that hospital room, and there on the hospital bed was their daughter Whitney with her arms outstretched, crying, calling for her parents. While this, of course, was a miracle for the Sareks, it was at the same time a complete nightmare for the Van Ryns. They had had their suspicions that something was off about their daughter, but they had been told by the doctors and by anybody who would talk to them that it was perfectly normal for people involved in these very significant accidents to look completely different or even act completely different. And so the Van Ryns just kind of put their suspicions to the side and focused on looking after their child and helping her recover. A few days later, Laura Van Ryn's body, which had been buried in Gaylord, Michigan, was exhumed and her body was flown to Caledonia, where the Van Ryn family was able to give their daughter a proper funeral and burial. Even though Whitney and Laura had only known each other very briefly during that volunteer event in Fort Wayne, their families would forge a bond over this shared trauma. And in 2008, 2 years after the crash, the Sareks and the Van Ryns would co-author a book about their experience in going through this horrible event from each of their perspectives. That book is called Mistaken Identity: Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope. Also that year, on April 26th, so the second anniversary of the accident, Taylor University would dedicate a prayer chapel to the 5 victims. Since the crash, Indiana has changed their state's protocols and procedures for identifying accident victims to ensure this type of mix-up can never happen again. As for Robert Spencer, the truck driver who caused the fatal accident, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.